Hello everybody. It really is an enormous pleasure to be here today at this inspiring research summit, and I would like to say a big thank you to Genomics England for the opportunity to start filling in that gap, the what, the breakthrough products, the therapies that are going to make a difference. And as we've heard in the fireside chat just then, the systems are getting ready. So let's think about what it is that we're going to be offering, as we are really on the cusp of a new era where patients who were previously untreatable now have the opportunity of a therapeutic option. But what we have to ask ourselves when we listen to these important case studies and some details I'm going to share with you, how can families be treated in a more equitable fashion? Because the vast majority of families aren't at this moment receiving these options. So what needs to be done to introduce change? And that's really the focus of what I'd like to share with you. I don't have any interests to declare. I'd like to look at three questions. First of all, thinking about some of these remarkable breakthroughs. Do they mandate, do they demand a change in our systems? How can the current UK initiatives that I'll enumerate and articulate for you actually enable access? And then the big question, who, which I think is visible in this community of Genomics England here today. We've heard a lot about the background today. Tremendously exciting. I don't think I've heard the word exciting so many times, but the fact that we've been hearing from Dame Sue Hill about accelerating genomic medicine, we know that there's an NHS England Rare Diseases Action Plan, and that has recently been updated. But if you like that filling in that sandwich again and again, we turn to Cathy Sudlow's review, Uniting the UK's Health Data, and what an opportunity it is for society, but a huge opportunity for rare diseases. So let's turn to the question, the first question, the why. And I'd like to just refresh memories for those who don't know about this little girl, Mila, who was 6 when she received a diagnosis, her family received a diagnosis of a rare form of Batten's disease. And a group of clinicians in the States who were able to elucidate and identify that mutation decided, knowing about a drug for spinal muscular atrophy, nusinersen, that might give a bit of hope, a ray of hope to the family, and they developed Milacen, an antisense oligonucleotide. And what you see over on the left are the fibroblasts, the skin cells it was tested on, and you can see, I think, not even with the eye of faith, that those vacuoles, the gaps, are not present on the bottom right visible slide where the patient the fibroblasts had been tested with the clinical grade drug. And what was most important for the family in that graphic on the bottom right is the fact that her distressing seizures decreased in duration and intensity. And the family, of course, realized that things had progressed rather considerably, and sadly she died at the age of 10. The researchers have gone on to treat other children, although their New England Journal paper does recognize that in fact what they have done may not be suitable for many children, but still a real landmark in individualized genomic medicine and an incredibly brave family. Fast forward then to a landmark regulatory decision, the first CRISPR-Cas9 product, Casgevy exa-cel, approved in November 23. And I well remember the moment when a senior person from the FDA said, "How can you license this on the basis of 82 patients?" Well, we were listening to those patients, Jimmy here saying his life had been transformed, and with very meticulous care to look for off-target effects, the benefits were deemed to outweigh the risks. A landmark progress since Charpentier and Doudna identified and progressed and won a Nobel Prize for CRISPR technology. And then, just last month, echoing round the newsreels worldwide, the world's first baby given CRISPR gene editing. This little chap in the States who had a very unusual abnormality of his liver metabolism, CPS1, I think I can call it, carbamyl phosphatase synthetase deficiency, that meant ammonia built up in his plasma. And normally these children die, at least half of them, very soon. Brave parents were able to work with the clinicians, and the clinicians, written up beautifully in the New England Journal, were able to use CRISPR technology to edit those hepatocytes, and you can almost see with the eye of faith again a dose response, top right, with the ammonia and the erotic acid in his plasma. And what that boring graph on the bottom right shows is that the search for off-target effects looked at 16 possibilities and did not find them. For a regulator, time is everything, and the pathway to develop the therapy for that little baby was actually 7 months, and that is absolutely remarkable. And it opens the doors to a lot of possibilities, as the researchers and clinicians have identified, even though after that intense period of work, it was right at the end that KJ, as he's called, was treated. So how can some initiatives that are happening in the UK at the moment begin to build the building blocks of achieving this vision, potentially of gene editing therapies being available soon after diagnosis? Well, we've been busy in the UK. The world first framework for being able to manufacture a medicine of high quality, safely at the point of care. And this legislation was enacted, and I think about Minister being here earlier, in a very exciting way, debates in Parliament last October, so that now it's being rolled out with industry coming on board. A very important first step. And we're not just looking at the UK here, but round the world, there are jurisdictions waiting to be able to adopt similar legislation. A small step, but very relevant to access to individualized therapies for rare diseases. And then the concept that you may not necessarily approve a product. This is the bedrock of regulation. You license a medicine for its benefit-risk balance. Now, a big change, a paradigm shift to platform technology being designated and approved. Colleagues in Australia have done some excellent work looking at how preclinical data can be extrapolated and not repeated every time, and the FDA have published their platform technology designation program. Again, this might sound all a bit bureaucratic, but let me take you back to the baby. Because in writing this up, that has stimulated a lot of regulatory thinking, and progress in the development of N=1 therapies was the subject of that recent editorial in the New England Journal. So we have to get real and say, what might a platform include? Now, here's the list proposed by the author of the editorial, Peter Marks, and I'm not going to go down all of them. But this is very much now the subject of debate. We need to get into the specifics before we can say we can license and approve platform technologies. You might debate whether you need item 6, the standardized method for immune suppression in conjunction with administration. Let the clinicians decide that. Or do you need to be very specific about every single detail? So again, you can see the importance of that single case and the thought process that it unleashes. And you can ask, how long is it going to take to get there? Turning then to evidence, again, I look over to the US FDA, to someone called Janet Woodcock, who was the acting commissioner during the pandemic, who's been a powerful advocate for access to therapies for rare diseases, and has said categorically, as someone who has spent her life in randomized clinical trials, what we all know to be true, they are not fit for purpose for rare diseases. And so she's looking to push self-controlled designs. We know they work well and have been used very effectively for vaccine safety studies. We need Bayesian approaches, and we need to build on those logical extrapolations from enzyme therapy replacement products. And so this very powerful voice is pushing hard to do things differently. Fortunately, it comes at just the right time here in the UK, where clinical trials regulation is being reformed. And we heard from 10-year plan man, from Vin de Varkar just then. You may have heard announcements yesterday, an enormous push coming in the 10-year plan for clinical trials. Be part of research, raising that public profile to make it the natural thing to do to be part of research. But in this reform of clinical trials, we need to go very much further to look at interoperability international, and that fancy logo, bottom left, is the logo we've chosen for our alliance, our consortium, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, so that we can enrich patient populations with master protocols that are immediately operable in different jurisdictions. And of course, I've highlighted the importance of innovative designs. I truly believe what we've heard from Minister, from Baroness Blackwood, that this should be the hotbed of innovation here in the UK for clinical trials. We showed it in the pandemic, we can do it again now for rare diseases. And then, on the ground, we are funding, in conjunction with UKRI, centres of excellence in regulatory science and innovation, particularly looking over at Manchester, where there'll be work on in silico trials. Let's learn from the researchers as they conduct their work so that regulation is better informed by that co-production, as Baroness Blackwood said. The end of the story always comes to the considerations by health technology assessment bodies, and it was a landmark, again, for NICE in approving Exa-cel-Casgevy for severe sickle cell disease. And why do I stress that? We all knew expensive therapy, lots of considerations about how you look at those outcomes, but they took into account in a very specific way, and I can tell you what it's called, distributional cost-effective analysis, the health equity issues. A really important step change. And the patient here, Fuomi, who is a student wanting to finish her postdoc, a real lifeline of hope, whereas she was only looking, I think, for a stem cell transplant. Up in Scotland, they've interestingly had an ultra-orphan medicines pathway for about 6 years now, and it's been used for medicines like Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy. But what you see there is a kind of elastic timeline, the critical small blue box being a patient access program. So let's again keep front of mind the reason why patients should be and are driving all of this. I think we can conclude when we think about that second question is that there's a lot happening. There are a myriad of pieces of work, building blocks that are building a foundation for access to breakthroughs. But collectively, do they give that common approach, and what will it take to actually move from where we are today to the future that we want to see? So the answer, of course, is working in collaboration. And I would like briefly now just to tell you of the important collaborations and how we can start to work with them and in them to deliver change. If we start internationally, the two important fora are the International Council for Harmonisation, which is where countries come together, including industry in the piece, to drive progress. And importantly, just last month, they announced a new efficacy guideline on natural history studies and registry data to advance rare disease drug development. And that's a very big step. The International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities had a symposium and a workshop last September and surfaced a lot of issues to be worked on. But when we look at these international fora, I think we need to be realistic about how quickly we will see progress. At European level, again, importantly, a new initiative of the Innovative Health Initiative called Realised, or Realise-D. And that begins to have some traction in that there are 40 public and private partners, a very decent budget, 17 million euros, and co-led by university, Sigmund Freud and AstraZeneca. So we can begin to see that this will be more action-orientated. But importantly is the work that we're doing here in the UK. So Munir Mohammed, we might have heard mentioned, our pharmacogenetics professor in Liverpool, is in charge of an expert working group, independent experts and patients. And you would expect its deliverables to be very much safety, quality, efficacy, safety monitoring, short and long term, and looking at communications. But importantly, the future application in the health service of highly personalised medicines is part of his mandate. And I think that gives this the potential for real impact. They've already been looking at the objective for cancer, the cancer vaccines mentioned earlier, and a model whereby tumour genomics are used to prepare an individual product given at the bedside, or even in the surgical operating room, and possibly we'll hear more about this at the fireside chat later today when colleagues are here from BioNTech. A guideline has been out for consultation. We love our charts, flow charts, but it should be operating by October. And I think that's a reasonably confident projection. So we're getting closer to taking out the waiting. The science is not the barrier, the system needs to be ready. And we've heard in very positive terms, really celebratory terms, the creation of the Rare Therapies Launchpad, this pilot program that brings together the relevant collaborators to actually start moving towards accredited centres. Now, work is going to be needed, quite a bit of work, on what that accreditation means. But we're well on the way, if you look at the timeline, through to starting to designate centres. These are the centres that we want to see on the ground that can actually be involved, not just in research, but actually in delivery and in treatment. Now, we're not starting from a blank page. Of course, there are centres already. And I'd like to pay tribute to the Oxford Harrington Rare Disease Centre, led by Professor Matthew Wood, Professor of Neuroscience at Oxford, who has a special interest in precision oligonucleotides and genetic medicines in the space of neuromuscular disease. But he's already got a number of spin-out companies and some assets, as they're called, groundbreaking projects working with other partners in academia in the US and Canada. And it's that sort of centre that is going to turbocharge access to products. A different sort of centre, one close to my heart, is the Birmingham Centre for Rare Diseases. And I speak warmly of this because, having recently been at the UK Kidney Association meeting, it's quite salutary to learn that of the children who present with renal failure, I believe about 80% have a genetic cause. Colleagues can tell me if they're happy with that figure. But what percentage actually get a genomic diagnosis? These scary conditions listed there. I think it's about 1 to 2%. And it's almost an exemplar of what the 10-year plan, in a sense, needs to think about. Because as a junior trainee, I would see massive files all about dialysis. And occasionally, if I asked, what was the diagnosis? It had gone a long time ago. So we need to turn that round. What Graham Lipkin, Dr. Lipkin, who's a nephrologist in Birmingham, is aiming to do is to create a one-stop shop for patients and their families so that they no longer have to go on that terrible journey of different specialists looking after a different aspect of their care. And he was motivated by one patient, a young man who had a cystic kidney disorder and was sort of lost in that transition period to adult care. A very powerful story of the incentive to make things happen here. But of course the Birmingham Centre will deal with all manner of rare diseases. I've just really used the renal conditions as an illustration. So I hope what I've tried to do is inject a sense of urgency in getting breakthroughs through to patients who can benefit from them. It has been said on a number of occasions, science is no longer the barrier. The evolving science, the drive that you in this community bring to this vital work, is going to continue, but the rest of our systems will need to sharpen. And carefully documented cases, I urge you to look at those New England Journal papers if you haven't seen them already. Meticulous, beautiful work. Those families that took those brave decisions really have to be celebrated. But they are a powerful case that we need to move towards a different kind of system. And I speak as an erstwhile regulator who now has to say goodbye to the product, the SPC, the PIL, and think about the platform that will deliver for a lot of patients. We do have building blocks. We've highlighted the importance of data and data science, manufacturing at the bedside, a guideline for cancer vaccines. How can we bring it all together so that that patient journey can be even shorter? Absolutely, collaboration is key, and we've talked a lot about the 3 themes for the 10-year plan: the analog to digital, sickness to prevention, healthcare setup, hospital to community. There is a 4th, research to reality. And as we finish now, I think we should look back at KJ and his terrible diagnosis and the brave decision his parents took so that he was the first baby to have CRISPR gene editing, and now, I gather, is on the 26th centile, having been on the 9th, 50 days after he was treated. So let's celebrate and let's together move forward. It's time to act.